How Hitler rose to power and lost everything. There is a question that haunts every generation that has studied the 20th century. How? How does a man, the failed son of a customs officer, a twice-rejected art student, a homeless drifter sleeping in Viennese shelters, how does that man become the most powerful dictator in the history of the Western world? And then, after seizing an entire nation, after bending a continent to his will, after launching the most catastrophic war in human history and engineering the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions more, how does he lose it all? This is not a story that celebrates Adolf Hitler. It is a story that dissects him and the world that made him possible. Because the most dangerous men in history are never monsters from the beginning. They begin as ordinary failures. April 20th, 1889. A small town on the border of Austria and Germany, Braunau am Inn. A boy is born to Alois Hitler, a stern Austrian customs official with a taste for discipline and an explosive temper, and Clara Hitler, a gentle, devoted mother who will love this child with a fierceness that borders on worship. His name, Adolf. Clara Hitler is the gravitational center of young Adolf's universe. She dotes on him, shields him, encourages his love of art and his fanciful dreams. She is perhaps the only person Adolf Hitler will ever truly love, or at least the only person he will grieve. His father, Alois, is another story entirely. Alois Hitler beat his children with belts. He mocked Adolf's dreams of becoming an artist. He was harsh, controlling, and coldly dismissive of the boy's ambitions. Adolf despised him. When Alois died in 1903, 14-year-old Adolf reportedly showed no grief. When Clara died of breast cancer in 1907, Adolf was 18. He wept openly at her bedside, and the family doctor, a Jewish physician named Eduard Bloch, who treated Clara without charge, later recalled that he had never seen a son so devastated by a mother's death. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. The man who would murder 6 million Jewish people was, as a weeping teenager, saved from destitution by the compassion of a Jewish doctor. After Clara's death, Hitler had one dream. He wanted to be a great painter. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Twice, he was rejected. The rejection letters were polite, clinical. They cited his weakness in figure drawing. His examiners felt his talent lay in architecture. But without a school diploma, he couldn't apply to the architecture program either. And so, at 19 years old, Adolf Hitler found himself in Vienna, one of the most glamorous, intellectually vibrant cities in Europe, with no qualifications, no family, no income, and no future. He spent 6 years drifting. He sold painted postcards for coins. He slept in homeless shelters. He ate at charity kitchens. And in those shelters and soup kitchens, surrounded by failure and resentment, something began to fester inside him. Vienna in 1909 was a hotbed of nationalist and anti-Semitic politics. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Demagogues held rallies. The charismatic anti-Semitic mayor, Karl Lueger, who Hitler later called the greatest German mayor of all time, was filling the city with poisonous rhetoric. Hitler absorbed it all. He read voraciously, not academic texts, but cheap pamphlets, pseudo-scientific racial theory, nationalist propaganda. He began constructing a worldview built on hatred of Jewish people, of Marxists, of the Slavic peoples he considered inferior. The seeds of genocide were planted in a Viennese homeless shelter. In 1914, the world went to war, and for Adolf Hitler, it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. He was 25, still a drifter, still nobody. But when Germany mobilized for the First World War, Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian army with what witnesses described as almost joyful excitement. For the first time in his life, Adolf Hitler belonged somewhere. He served on the Western Front for 4 years. He was a runner, a messenger, one of the most dangerous jobs in the trenches, carrying dispatches between command posts through artillery fire and mustard gas. He was wounded twice. He was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, a decoration typically reserved for officers, for bravery under fire. His commanding officer later said Hitler was the bravest soldier he had ever known. War had given him identity, purpose, brotherhood. And then, in November 1918, while recovering in a military hospital from a British gas attack that had temporarily blinded him, it was taken away. Germany surrendered. The news devastated Hitler. He later wrote that he wept, that it was the only time since his mother's death that he cried. Germany's defeat was, to men like Hitler, not merely a military failure. It was a betrayal, a stab in the back. The stab in the back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, would become the defining political lie of the next decade. The claim that Germany had not truly lost the war, but had been sabotaged from within by Jewish conspirators, socialists, and traitors. It was false. Completely, demonstrably false. But it was exactly what a humiliated nation needed to hear, and no one would sell it more skillfully than Adolf Hitler. Before we go further, we need to understand something essential about Adolf Hitler. He was not brilliant in the conventional sense. He never mastered economics, strategy, or military science in any rigorous way. He read obsessively but selectively, consuming only what confirmed his existing beliefs. What he did possess, in world historical quantities, was a gift for reading a crowd. He could feel the emotional temperature of a room and bend it. He studied oratory with the obsession of a performer. He practiced his gestures in front of mirrors. He experimented with pauses, with voice modulation, with the crescendo of outrage and the whisper of promised salvation. Every failure in his personal life, the rejected paintings, the homeless years, the humiliation of the gas attack, the grief for his mother, he transformed into fuel. He never forgave, he never forgot, and he never stopped. The arc of Adolf Hitler is the arc of a man who took the wreckage of his own life and weaponized it. That is what makes him so dangerous to study and so impossible to look away from. Germany after the First World War was a country in ruins, not just physically, but spiritually. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 had humiliated Germany on a global stage. The nation was stripped of territory, saddled with crippling war reparations, and forbidden from maintaining a meaningful military. Unemployment exploded. Inflation became so catastrophic that people burned currency for warmth because it was cheaper than firewood. Into this void stepped a caste of extremists, opportunists, and true believers. And in Munich's beer halls, a failed Austrian painter discovered he had a voice that could shake walls. Hitler joined a tiny fringe group called the German Workers' Party in 1919, member number 55. Within 2 years, his oratorical talent had transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, with thousands of members and a distinctive symbol, the swastika. He cultivated an image deliberately, the peaked cap, the toothbrush mustache, the simple military jacket while other politicians wore suits. He presented himself not as a polished elite, but as a man of the folk, the ordinary German people. He held rallies that felt less like political meetings and more like religious revivals. People wept. They cheered until their throats were raw. They reached out to touch him as he passed. In November 1923, emboldened by the success of Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year, Hitler attempted to seize power by force. The Beer Hall Putsch, November 8, 1923. Hitler and a column of armed Nazis marched through Munich, attempting to trigger a nationalist revolution. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. He served 9 months. In prison, Hitler was treated less like a convicted traitor and more like a celebrity. He received fan mail by the sackful. Visitors arrived daily with gifts and flowers. The prison warden was a devoted admirer, and in that comfortable cell, with his loyal deputy Rudolf Hess at his side, Adolf Hitler dictated a book. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It was part autobiography, part political manifesto, and entirely a blueprint for everything that would follow. His hatred of Jewish people laid out in explicit, chilling detail, his plan for German racial supremacy, his ambition to conquer Eastern Europe for German Lebensraum, living space. The world had the instruction manual. Almost nobody took it seriously. Released from prison in December 1924, Hitler made a decision that would reshape his strategy entirely. No more coups, No more street fighting as the primary method. He would take power legally, through elections, through the democratic system. He would use the tools of the Republic to destroy the Republic. For the next several years, the Nazi Party ground away at the margins of German politics, a noisy but minor presence. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across the Atlantic and decimated the German economy, which had been kept alive largely by American loans. Unemployment in Germany shot from 1.3 million to over 6 million by 1932. Overnight, Hitler's message of national humiliation, betrayal, and the need for a strongman savior went from the fringe to the mainstream. The Nazi vote totals tell the story with brutal clarity. In the 1928 national elections, the Nazis received 2.6% of the vote. In 1930, after the Depression hit, they received 18.3%. In July 1932, 37.4%. They were the largest party in the Reichstag. Germany's conservative elites, wealthy industrialists, aristocratic military officers, establishment politicians, looked at this phenomenon and made one of history's greatest miscalculations. They believed they could control Hitler. They would put him in the chancellor's seat, use his populist energy to stabilize the country, and manage him from behind the scenes. He was, they told each other, a useful idiot. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, aged 85, exhausted, manipulated by advisors, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Hitler had 3 cabinet members who were fellow Nazis. The rest were conservatives who were certain they had everything under control. Within weeks, they would understand their catastrophic error. Within 6 months, there would be no more elections. Within a year, there would be no more political parties except one. Within 2 years, when Hindenburg died, Hitler would merge the offices of President and Chancellor and call himself Führer. The useful idiot had eaten them alive. To understand how Adolf Hitler maintained power, how he transformed a democracy into a totalitarian state with the active enthusiasm of millions of ordinary Germans, you have to understand one man, Paul Joseph Goebbels. Born in 1897 in the Rhine, Goebbels was, in many ways, the polar opposite of the image he helped create. Where the Nazi Party celebrated physical strength and Aryan appearance, Goebbels was slight, dark-haired, and walked with a pronounced limp from a childhood case of osteomyelitis, a foot deformity that had prevented him from serving in World War I, a fact that tormented him his entire life. Where the Nazis glorified the simple, instinctual man of the soil, Goebbels held a PhD in literature and philosophy from the University of Heidelberg. He had, before discovering politics, desperately wanted to be a novelist. He was also deeply, profoundly anti-Semitic, even by Nazi standards. And he was perhaps the most gifted propagandist of the 20th century. When Hitler appointed him Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, Goebbels set to work with the enthusiasm of an artist who has finally found his canvas. He controlled everything: newspapers, radio, film, theater, music, art, architecture. What Germans read, heard, saw, and thought, all of it flowed through Joseph Goebbels. He organized the infamous book burnings of May 1933. Tens of thousands of books by Jewish authors, political dissidents, and intellectuals piled into pyres in town squares across Germany. When the exiled German poet Heinrich Heine's words were read aloud, "Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also," words Heine had written a century earlier, the crowds cheered. Goebbels understood something fundamental about mass psychology. People don't just want information, they want belonging, they want drama. They want a story in which they are the heroes. He gave them that story. He commissioned Leni Riefenstahl to film the 1934 Nuremberg Rally. The result, Triumph of the Will, remains one of the most technically accomplished and morally monstrous pieces of filmmaking ever created. It showed Hitler descending from the clouds like a god. Goebbels' personal life was, like everything about him, a study in contradictions. He preached German family values. He had 6 children with his wife, Magda. Children he would ultimately help murder in the bunker in 1945, rather than allow them to grow up in a world without Nazism. He also kept a secret diary, one of history's most extraordinary documents, in which he recorded his genuine admiration for Hitler, his fears, his jealousies, and his awareness that the war was being lost long before he admitted it publicly. Joseph Goebbels was not a cynical operator who privately disbelieved the propaganda he produced. He believed it. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing thing about him. February 27, 1933. The Reichstag building, Germany's parliament, was set ablaze. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found inside, apparently responsible. Whether he acted alone, or whether the Nazis themselves had a hand in the fire, remains historically debated to this day. What is not debated is what happened next. Within 24 hours, Hitler had the Reichstag fire decree signed into law, suspending civil liberties, freedom of the press, and the right to assembly. It was the legal foundation of the police state. The arrests began immediately. Communist leaders, socialist politicians, trade union organizers, journalists, intellectuals. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Hitler became chancellor. In the summer of 1934, Hitler eliminated even his own allies who had grown too powerful or inconvenient. The Night of the Long Knives, June 30, 1934, saw the leadership of the SA, including Ernst Röhm, one of Hitler's oldest associates, murdered in their beds. It sent an unmistakable message. No one was safe. Not even true believers. Unemployment dropped from 6 million in 1932 to under 1 million by 1938. Autobahns were being built. Factories were roaring. The Olympics came to Berlin in 1936, and Germany staged a spectacle of such apparent prosperity and order that much of the world was dazzled. What the world didn't fully see, or didn't want to see, was that the economic recovery was largely built on secret military rearmament in violation of the Versailles Treaty, and on the systematic theft of Jewish property and businesses. The prosperity was real for most Germans. It was built on the destruction of others. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, November 9th and 10th, 1938. In a single night of orchestrated violence, Nazi stormtroopers and civilians attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Over 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. 91 people were killed in the immediate violence. Thousands more died in the aftermath. The streets were literally carpeted with broken glass. Goebbels had helped orchestrate it. The morning after, he stood before a crowd and told them it had been a spontaneous expression of the German people's righteous anger. The world watched, and mostly, shamefully, looked away. There is a third figure whose story runs beneath the surface of everything we have described. Hidden from the German public, hidden from most of the world, hidden even from many within the Nazi inner circle. Her name was Eva Braun, and she was Adolf Hitler's companion for nearly 16 years. Born in 1912, Eva Braun was 17 years old when she met Adolf Hitler at the Munich photography studio of his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, where she worked as an assistant. Hitler was 40. Their relationship began slowly, in stolen moments. He gave her flowers. He called her his little sunshine. She was vivacious, athletic, stylish, the opposite of everything the Nazi regime presented as its ideal. She smoked. She loved American films. She drank champagne. She once confided in her diary that she was not interested in politics. Hitler kept her existence almost entirely secret from the German public. The image he cultivated was of a man married to Germany itself, celibate, devoted, belonging to no single woman but to his nation. Eva Braun lived in the shadows. She was excluded from official events. When important guests arrived at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, she was sometimes sent to her room. She was, by most accounts, lonely. She attempted suicide twice, once in 1932, once in 1935. Both times, Hitler's response was to give her more attention, more jewelry, a nicer apartment. She was not a political actor. She left no evidence of any influence over Hitler's decisions. She was not a member of the Nazi Party. And yet, she stayed. Historians have wrestled with Eva Braun for decades. Was she a victim? A willing companion to a monster? Was she simply a woman who fell in love with a man before she fully understood what he was, and then found herself too deep to leave? The truth is, we don't know. Her letters and diaries reveal a woman consumed by romantic obsession, tormented by her invisibility, and yet stubbornly devoted. She wrote in her diary, "He needs me for something, I don't know what." Eva Braun's story is not a love story in any conventional sense. It is a story about what it means to be entirely erased, and to accept that erasure, in the shadow of absolute power. Her arc ends where everything ends, in a Berlin bunker, in April 1945, as the Soviet army closes in. But we will come to that. September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, German forces crossed into Poland. World War II had begun. In less than 6 weeks, Poland, attacked simultaneously from the west by Germany and from the east by the Soviet Union under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Europe was stunned. What followed was a military campaign of such speed and force that it seemed to defy belief. April 1940. Denmark and Norway fell. May 1940. Germany bypassed the Maginot Line entirely and swept through Belgium and the Netherlands. June 22, 1940. France surrendered. France, which had withstood 4 years of trench warfare in the First World War, fell in 46 days. Hitler stood in the same railway carriage in Compiègne Forest, where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918 and dictated the terms of France's surrender. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled most of continental Europe. Only Britain remained defiant. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister in May 1940, and his response to Hitler's triumphant offers of a negotiated peace was elemental, iron-willed refusal. The Battle of Britain, the air war over England, raged through the summer and autumn of 1940. The Luftwaffe hammered British cities. London burned night after night in the Blitz. But the RAF held. Hitler, impatient and miscalculating, shifted the bombing from airfields to civilian targets, a tactical error that gave the RAF time to recover. Britain did not fall. Then Hitler made the decision that most military historians regard as the beginning of the end. On June 22, 1941, exactly a year after France's surrender, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. A front stretching nearly 2,000 miles, 3 million German soldiers. It was the largest military operation in human history. Hitler had convinced himself the Soviet Union was a hollow shell that would collapse in weeks. His generals had told him it would be over before winter. They were catastrophically wrong. The Soviets, caught almost entirely off guard, suffered staggering initial losses. Millions captured or killed in the first months. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It bled, it retreated, it reorganized. And then winter came. German soldiers in summer uniforms froze to death at temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius. Tanks seized up. Supply lines stretched and broke. The Wehrmacht, designed for rapid conquest, found itself in a war of attrition against an enemy with virtually unlimited manpower and an iron will to survive. Hitler had opened a front that would eventually consume his army. We must stop here, because while the military campaigns raged across Europe and Russia, Adolf Hitler was pursuing another war, a systematic, industrialized campaign of murder unlike anything the world had ever seen or has seen since. The Holocaust. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. The bureaucratic language of the Wannsee Conference is perhaps the most chilling document in history. The cold administrative discussion of genocide, transportation schedules, processing capacity, regional quotas. The killing had, in fact, already begun. Mobile death squads called Einsatzgruppen had been murdering Jewish communities across Eastern Europe since the summer of 1941, in mass shootings at the edges of forests and ravines. Now it was industrialized. Treblinka, Sobibor, Bełchatów, Chełmno, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most lethal death camp in history, where over 1 million Jewish people were murdered, along with hundreds of thousands of Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, gay men, people with disabilities, and political prisoners. By the end of the war, 6 million Jewish people had been murdered, 2 out of every 3 Jewish people in Europe. 1 million of them were children. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of the war. It was not something that happened in the chaos of combat. It was deliberately planned, methodically organized, and carried out with the full machinery of the German state. Its railways, its civil service, its courts, its corporations. Adolf Hitler did not personally operate a gas chamber. He created the political conditions, the ideology, and the institutional framework that made it possible, and he ordered it done. This is the irreducible center of any examination of Adolf Hitler's life. Not the rallies, not the military campaigns, not the political genius. This. By the winter of 1942, the tide of the war had begun to turn. The Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest single battle in human history, lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. The German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was surrounded by Soviet forces. Hitler refused to allow a breakout or retreat. He ordered them to hold at all costs. On February 2, 1943, the VRI,